All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar about Spotlight and what faith communities can learn from the movie. I'll introduce our presenters in a few minutes, but first we need to go over some technical information. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen, which is in the wrong place. There it is. If you're having problems with the sound, please check to make sure that your headset or speakers are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other problems, please log out of the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to reconnect that way. That usually takes care of most of the problems. All the audience members are muted. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me at any time during the presentation using the question box feature on the right side of your screen. If you don't see the question box, there should be a small orange arrow, and if you click on the arrow, it will open up the question feature. We would love to hear from you, so submit your questions and then I'll hold on to them until the last 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation, and we'll take your questions then. The slides you see on your screen will be sent to you later this afternoon as a PDF for your reference, and we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join the live session. So if you have friends who weren't able to attend, please let them know that the recording will be available. I also want you to know that I've attached a couple of handouts for you. One is our multi-faith discussion guide to Spotlight from Faith Trust Institute, and we've also attached the United Church of Christ Spotlight Guide, which is specific to the denominations issues. So our presenters today, first is Mary Dispenza. She is a former Catholic nun, educator, and a National Distinguished Principal. She's an activist for equal rights and for the protection of children, and serves as a Puget Sound representative for SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. Mary is the author of a memoir titled Split, A Child, a Priest, and the Catholic Church. Reverend Holly Millershank currently serves as the minister and team leader of the Ministerial Excellence Support and Authorization, MESA, ministry team of the UCC. MESA strives to support authorized ministers in the UCC throughout the arc of their ministry. She has served as a Global Ministries volunteer in India, as well as on the board of Ministry Issues Implementation Committee and the Local Church Ministry Board of Directors. She holds a four-way covenant as a minister in the national setting of the denomination, and prior to joining the UCC national staff, she served as pastor and teacher of Grace UCC in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. And lastly, Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune is the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. She's been central to the ongoing movement with both faith communities and secular advocates in addressing domestic and sexual violence and abuse. She's written extensively on the issue of clergy misconduct, and her books are widely read and considered foundational references in the field. So just a reminder, folks, send in your questions anytime, and we're going to launch a little survey here to let us know what your role is. And I'm going to welcome everybody to the webinar.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
So you're going to give us a quick response on the poll, right?
Yes, indeed. Okay, here we go.
Okay, interesting. All right, a third clergy, a fourth advocates, and almost half others. I'm really interested in who you others are. So maybe you can send us a note and let us know your interest in this topic and so forth. But in any case, thank you for doing that. That always just gives us a sense of who all is involved in this conversation. So I'm Marie Fortune. Again, welcome. And we're focusing on the movie Spotlight, which amazingly won Best Movie of the Year at the Academy Awards. I'm sort of going to assume that most of you who are with us have seen the movie, and if not, I hope that this discussion will encourage you to go out and see it. It's now available on DVD and on streaming various places if you can just go look for it there. One of the things as we were preparing for this that I was thinking about is the the fact that the movie takes place, the story that it tells is of the Archdiocese of Boston in the early 2000s, when the Boston Globe finally broke the story of the history of abuse in the Archdiocese and the cover-up. And so that's like 15 years ago that story was going on. And I think some people probably walked away from the film thinking, well, wasn't that terrible that was happening then? And just to make sure we're in context, I want to remind us and update us that just this past week, another story came out about the Diocese of Altoona, Johnstown in Pennsylvania, where the grand jury is considering filing a racketeering lawsuit against the Catholic diocese there for the cover-up of sexual abuse of hundreds of children by more than 50 clergy over a 40-year period. So that's basically a current situation where we'll be learning more about what happened when and if it's possible to hold anyone accountable in that setting at this time. And also this past week, just to make sure we're kind of covering everybody who's worrying about these issues, the Episcopal Church and its national office, the presiding bishop, has fired 2 top executives for failing, quote, to live up to the church's standards of personal conduct in their relationships with employees. At least the stories I've seen do not specify the nature of the misconduct involved, but it sounds like it's a situation of employment misconduct, which is yet another place within our church structures where we are dealing with problems of boundary violations such as this. So these situations are much with us, and our various denominational groups are responding in a variety of ways, and we'll talk some about that as we go through. But mostly we want to focus on the film Spotlight and what it tells us and how it helps us as faith leaders and members of faith communities understand this situation and how we can be involved in responding to it. So I want to initially just ask each of our panelists, Mary and Holly, to just respond in general to the film and when you saw it, what you thought and kind of how it struck you given the role that you play. So Holly, would you start, please?
Sure, absolutely. It is really a blessing to be here and to be part of this conversation. The way that our interaction with Spotlight began was that my supervisor, the Reverend Ben Guess, had seen the movie with family, and he was so intrigued by it that he invited our entire staff team of 8 members to go out and to see the movie together. And we intentionally left time afterwards for conversation. I think for me personally, the power of Spotlight was that it focused not just on a single individual case, but the systemic problems of silence that helped this particular community to continue to perpetuate such violence. And I really appreciated that the film looked at ethical values, not just of the clergy, but also what do ethics look like for reporters? What do ethics look like for law enforcement? What are ethics for legal counsel? And so that it was a really good holistic understanding of how an entire community is part of the problem and can be part of the solution.
Great, thank you. Mary, what about for you? How did you initially respond on seeing the movie?
Well, for me, as a survivor of priest abuse, of course, it was very close, and I was riveted from the beginning to the end. It seemed as if I didn't breathe, but of course I did. And it was as if it were my story and the story of hundreds, thousands of other persons abused by clergy. So it was for a survivor, perhaps one of the first times to really have your story and your life validated before thousands of viewers, and a time to have our voices heard and our stories told. So it also struck me about the power of secrecy, because that, I believe, is what has kept this terrible era in the Catholic Church undercover, the power of secrecy that we've all held because of shame or fear. And so breaking that open a bit is what I saw, I believe Spotlight did for us. It opened it in a way that it's never been opened before. And it generated dialogue and shook us up a bit. So those were some of the things it did for me.
Well, we want to focus initially on the voices of survivors that are portrayed in the film. And so, and you've highlighted that, Mary, in your response. But what do you think was most important, particularly for an audience that, let's say, has some distance from this problem and may not have really been following the news stories earlier? So this may be really a new story for a lot of people to finally sit down and look closely at in the film. What do you think was the most important thing that was conveyed by the survivors in their portrayals in the film? Mary, do you want to start?
Well, I think the stories are almost always the most significant piece of the issue. For example, the journalistic piece was a great deal about facts and data, which are very important. However, without the stories, they just kind of remain facts and data. So those stories were extremely powerful, I believe, and to me, again, as a survivor, they touched me as much as the journalistic, scholarly information that was gathered. And I think in the story, there is the truth. And so having people come forward and continuing to tell their stories, I thought, again, was one of the most powerful pieces. And for people who, for the first time, as you stated, went to the movie and saw Spotlight, I think they would have left changed. And it was the power of the stories, I believe, that had that power to bring a change to someone who, for the first time, is realizing, oh my God, that actually happened and is happening.
And it happened to someone who could have been, my child, my brother, myself, the immediacy of their stories, what they shared. Holly, how about for you? How were you struck by that?
You know, and I thought it was really interesting in the movie how they captured the variety of possible experiences by those who were victimized, in that some of the individuals really wanted to tell their story and be heard, and others were very reluctant. And I thought it did a good job of showcasing the multitude of ways in which people process. And I also thought there were interesting personal growth narratives for each of the reporters, and for me that showed that the violence of sexual misconduct by clergy has an absolutely devastating effect on their victims, but it also affects the whole community. And to watch the experience of each of the reporters try to wrestle with their own understanding of their faith after finding out this information, I thought was a really interesting extension of the story.
Well, I agree, and also the movie was a reminder that we're all a part of the story.
Yeah.
And that's a piece that we have to take hold of. We were all a part of the problem, and we're now, or can be, all a part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And to put our arms around that and really be with that could make us a significant change in the church and for the healing process of survivors and their families.
Sarah, jump to the slide 8, if you would, the community, because that's really where Mary's going with this conversation. And it is focusing on the bystander, the sort of third person in the picture, which, again, I thought the film was terrific in, it was really told as the story of the bystander, that is the reporters, the lawyers, the law enforcement people. It was told from their perspective, which is the perspective that many of us bring to a situation like this when we finally stop and look at it. And you're absolutely right, Mary, that it challenges all of us in that role of bystander is what is our responsibility. And I thought as Holly, you said, the growth process and watching the kind of moral development of the folks involved was particularly powerful as they began to see the whole thing and then realize what it meant and the harm that it was had caused and was causing, and what they could do about it, could have done about it earlier and didn't. So everybody was challenged to really come to terms with it.
Yeah. There's a line in the movie. It's, I think, Mike Resendez, he says something like, they knew it, and they let it happen anyway. And that's a profound line. It stayed with me because I think it's happening right now in churches. They know, and they're still not coming clean and standing up and taking responsibility and holding the perpetrators accountable and giving over files and records to make this problem go away. They're still, they know it and they're doing it. I think that if there is sin, that is sin.
Yeah, in a similar way, when I think about lines that remain with me, it's the line that it's in the clips, and that was throughout the film, kind of saying, like, we tried to tell you, like, if you would have paid attention, you would have seen that there is a pattern developing here. But I think it also speaks to our, Mary used the word sin, but I think it's our sin of omission and our sin of just busying ourselves so much that we don't take the time to see the patterns that are developing. And that was really a growth moment for, I believe it was Robbie, was that character who realized that he was the one who neglected to look at detail at all these clips that had been coming in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it's that challenge to the bystander to take the time to stop and pay attention. And to be honest, I think whenever we're in the position of the bystander to any of these horrors, none of us want to know this. None of us want to see, to really open our eyes, because it is so painful. But that's our job. I mean, that, as far as I'm concerned, that's our job as people of faith, is to, stop and pay attention. It's the Good Samaritan. It's the, take the time to look and to see what we see, and then to determine what does that call us to do in response. And that's where I think the film challenges everybody who sees it.
It's kind of, it is shocking to me and probably others when you realize, like with the Altoona Johnstown incident, that I read that the police were involved in the cover-up, the district attorneys and judges. And that, I mean, I don't want to believe that.
Right.
I say, oh my goodness, So
Right,
it's
right. Is nobody in charge? I mean, you know, it's like, is nobody in charge who has, you know, the authority or the sort of moral courage to stand up and address these issues within all of these various institutional settings, because that's where it goes on, and that's why it continues to go on, is because the institution, and that's what this line, it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse one, from the movie, I think is really naming for all of us.
And it is sad to say, all about protecting the institution. And in this case, above children. And so breaking that down remains a significant challenge.
Right, and we're going to talk more about that in just a few minutes when we get a little further into it. But I want to go back now, Sarah, if we could, to the discussion of power and vulnerability. And just ask you both to think about how the particular instance of abuse and exploitation that we see here in the abuse of children by faith leaders, how does the role of the faith leader particularly magnify that harm done and those issues of power and vulnerability? Can both of you talk about that? Holly, would you start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. One of the things that takes place in the formation of someone moving towards ordination or practice of ministry is to really become self-aware and to realize the power of the pulpit and the power of the sacraments. You are in some ways serving as a vessel or a conductor of the holy, and that there are boundaries and responsibilities that go along with that role. And it's important to know those not just personally, but to practice them, because there are often times where as a member of the clergy, you cannot predict how someone will be interpreting you or responding to you. And I think it just adds to this responsibility of the role to constantly be aware of the magnitude in which your words and actions influence others. Because it's not just you as a person, it's you as a representative of, yes, an institution, but of something that is holy and sacred. And that comes with great responsibility.
And sometimes I worry in our training of folks for ministry that we're not adequately, well, as you've lifted up, we're not adequately preparing them to realize that and to appreciate what that means. In a context, it's not about you know, you're not God here, but you have a responsibility because you're representing that which is holy, and hopefully in a way that represents God in people's lives, and they trust us amazingly, which continues to surprise me at this point in time, that our people still trust us and still expect us to you know, to behave in ways that are in their best interest.
Right.
Mary, what about?
Oh, just let me follow up real quick, and that the pastoral role is not one that is isolated to particular hours of the day or of the week, but the pastoral role is something that you carry with you in perpetuity. And I think there's a tendency to want to say, well, I'm not wearing that hat right now, and that's just not possible.
And if you can't hang with that, you need to go find another job.
Yeah.
Basically. So, Mary, what about for you in terms of?
Well, I go to a couple of different places. I think, of course, whenever there's an imbalance of power, there is going to be an abuse of some sort. And so, of course, with a clergy and a child, that piece is already in place. And I think it's as a representative of God, as you're taught as a child, the priest is God, or the closest person to represent God. And so it's a major assault on a child, especially in their entire life, on their spiritual and psychological being. And it's a violent, terrible betrayal. And it's also heightened by the fact that the whole larger community is involved in it. At least as we grow up and become adults as survivors, we begin to see the extent of it. It wasn't just the priest. It was the bishops, the community. And so it's a major betrayal and violation and a misuse of power.
Right, and I think one of the survivors in the film reflected that when he said something to the effect of, you know, when the priest showed up at our house, it was like God came to visit.
Yeah, and another scene of one of the survivors when being interviewed, the question is, so what did your mother do? And he laughed and he said, she went and made cookies for the bishop.
Yeah, right.
So,
yeah, so it had that effect on not just the child, but also the adults involved. And again, because people do trust their faith leaders, or they should be able to. And I always say to people, you know, don't trust us unconditionally, but if we've earned your trust, I would hope that you are able to trust us to, you know, do the right thing and be thoughtful and careful in our relationships around boundaries. But the power of that is pretty significant.
yes. Yes.
What about, let's go on to talk some more about, let's see, Sarah, let's go to justice and restoration, because that's the other place that Mary was taking us. Is what do we do in terms of, it's about the institutional issues. One of the things that has always amazed me as I've worked with various denominations and judicatories around this issue is this whole notion that somehow the behavior of the leaders of the diocese or the conference or what have you are acting to protect that institution, and that's how they often see what they're doing and so forth. And we certainly saw that in an extreme form in the film Spotlight. The irony to me is that they in fact are not protecting the institution by not protecting the people of the institution, particularly the most vulnerable, the children. And it keeps coming back. I mean, you know, again, the film just shows the whole picture of what they did not only caused harm to individuals and allowed that harm to continue, but basically compromised the moral authority of the church and literally financially has driven some dioceses to bankruptcy. So the institution is not even being protected, in fact, and yet that is supposedly the rationale for the way this has been handled so poorly. So what's the alternative to that? How do we help the leadership understand that it's really in no one's best interest to either avoid dealing with this or deal with it in ways that are so destructive? Holly, you're an institutional person. How do you deal with that?
Right. I think this is really right up our alley in terms of being able to talk about what are the codes of conduct and ethical codes for clergy as someone is preparing to enter the ministry. I don't think it's helpful for us to, after the fact, be responding to misconduct, but actually to set expectations for appropriate conduct at the very onset. I think that's the responsibility of the institution, of places of discernment and formation, to be able to offer that. And I also want to be clear that clergy sexual misconduct happens in every denomination, and while Spotlight really does focus on a particular diocese of the Catholic Church, there is sexual misconduct in evangelical circles and in Protestant circles and in every faith community. And so it's incumbent upon every institution to not be silent, but to have processes that are accessible and available, so clergy know what is expected of them and appropriate of them, but that also so members of those faith communities know who to reach out to if there is a type of misconduct that happens, and what resources are available to them in terms of the processes laid out by each denomination.
Right. So we're dealing with both prevention, hopefully, and intervention when necessary.
Correct.
And on the prevention side, in terms of training, how do you feel like that has progressed in terms of our capacity to better train people at the front end of ministry?
I actually think I can speak just for the United Church of Christ perspective, but one of the things that's become across the board for us is that all of our ministers attend regular boundary awareness training sessions in order to maintain their ministerial standing. And I think that is an excellent way of saying that this is a topic that you don't just talk about one time and say that you're finished with it, but it's on a repeating cycle, because we need to engage in these conversations on a regular basis. And I think also the one of the common trainings that is offered from my office is how do we help those in local settings who are trying to discover if misconduct has occurred, that they're well trained to be able to ask the hard questions and to really suss out what is the truth, so that way ministers can be held accountable for their actions, and that there is a viable outlet for people to be able to tell their story.
Right. So the training of the staff and the volunteers who are involved in the appropriate committees to hear those complaints is absolutely critical to any diocese or conference having the capacity to respond. And I think that's, again, one of the missing pieces that we see in Spotlight. And I would say I've seen it consistently across our denominational settings, is, at least in the early days, people did not have a clue what to do with this information. They made some, clearly in the Spotlight story, they made some terrible assumptions and terrible mistakes in that regard. But I still don't understand, given the information that was shared with them and that was coming from survivors directly, why they didn't reach out and ask for help from the wider community and from experts in the field to begin to try to figure out how to do this and how to address it appropriately. Their ignorance is appalling and inexcusable, and certainly inexcusable at this point in time, given that there is available help to address it. But what about, Mary, for you,
Well,
in terms of that institutional piece of it?
I think in the Catholic Church, there has been some progress, of course, and education and training. However, I'm still concerned because I think a lot of the continual problem of covering up and concealing and not coming out with the truth goes way back to the pontifical secret piece that is still in canon law in the Catholic Church, which continues a code of secrecy, and I believe it still permeates the priesthood. and has to be broken down and taken apart. And it's my understanding that recently in a training for newly ordained priests, they were told they did not have to report priest abuse to the authorities, that that was the job of the family and the individual. Well, statements or positions like that do not help at all. And it's time for that to really shift and change. So the secrecy piece to me remains a great, big, significant problem in preventing us from moving forward and acting in new and different ways. And also, we continue to talk about the files, the secret files that most bishops do not want to turn over. Well, in keeping those files secret, it just protects and makes it more probable that priests will continue to offend, because there's no real consequence if you keep all of that under wraps. So, ultimately, I do believe it gets to the people in the pews, the parishioners. They need to stand up and speak out and say what they want of their church. And it is, we always say the church, the people are the church. So then the people have to stand up and become a part of the solution. And I believe they can, but will they is the question.
Well, certainly there's a lot more than ever before, and partly due to efforts like yours, Mary, as an advocate, and organizations like SNAP and so forth are part of that ongoing effort to really bring the issues to the public and encourage people to be involved. But I appreciated your bringing up the point about the training where the bishops were told that they didn't have to report. That was the trainer in the Vatican who is the person responsible for training new bishops, and that was coming out of the Pope's Commission on the Protection of Children. And when I read that, I had the same reaction. It's like, wait a minute. These are the people who are supposed to get it and supposed to be bringing a new way of dealing with this right out of the Vatican. And you've got somebody in there doing training who is telling them they don't have to report.
Yeah,
and then if I recall accurately, it was Cardinal O'Malley from Boston, who is on the commission, who then came out publicly and said, no, we have a moral responsibility to report regardless, which I really appreciated that he stood up and said that. And that's the kind of response from within the institution, the kind of leadership that I think is going to help change that and try to get people on track with at least those principles. So in terms of the possibilities of healing and the truth-telling, accountability, and so forth, the things that certainly the film lifted up and needed to happen. I thought one of the throwaway lines in the film, it was kind of interesting. I can't remember which character had the line, but he was somehow a functionary in the diocese. I don't remember if he was one of the lawyers or the staff, but somebody, and he sort of casually said, well, all these people want, meaning the survivors who were coming forward, all these people want is just to be heard and have a little money, and I thought at the time, well, that's exactly right, but he was saying it in such a way as to really denigrate that expectation. And yet, that's what I hear consistently in talking with survivors, is the primary thing is to be heard. So, Mary, what was your take on that in terms of how the film portrayed that desire and then that possibility for folks?
Well, I think, of course, we all want to be heard. I don't think it's unique to survivors. However, I just attended 2 weeks ago some, something called the Gathering put on by.
Good.
I just attended something called the Gathering put on by SNAP, and there were 18 to 20 survivors, and for many it was their first time to tell their story because of shame and fear and all kinds of reasons. But the power in it was visible to us to see the relief that came over each person as they articulated and in some cases for the first time put words to their to the experience of having been abused. And so I think that line in the movie was said rather flippantly, but there really is truth to the power of story, and becoming a community that is a safe place for all of us to tell our stories is something communities need to work towards, being that kind of a community that wants to hear stories, wants to understand them, wants to validate the storyteller. And you know, the piece about money, I think that sometimes it's sad to say, but some institutions only begin to change when their pocketbook is attacked and when they have to pay up. It's happened in schools around gay bashing until someone filed a suit against the school district. There was little attention paid. And then finally, oh, we better do something about this. So the piece about filing suits and the monetary recompense for sins and violence against children, I believe is legitimate, and it makes us pay attention. And it's sad that has to be the way, but sometimes it is. And it also, in some cases, there are many survivors who have no money at all because they've been so badly harmed that they can't work. They're into drugs. And the biggest sadness, of course, are the many who have actually taken their lives. So the money is sometimes needed for the therapy, the medical expenses, and so that shouldn't be taken lightly, telling our stories and recompense.
Which are experiences, I think, for us in a theological context of justice, that those are ways that justice is actually manifest in response to the harm that's done. And it doesn't take it away, but it can be enormously helpful in the healing process. And that's the irony of that casual line in the film is, I mean, I totally agree with you. It is true. And if the institution would just pay attention to that is what people are asking for, why can't we give it to them? What's so hard about this? Because that's what they need and deserve from their church. And frankly, if the institution would provide that, they'd be in a lot better position in terms of their assets than they are right now.
Yes, they would. But again, I think the stumbling block for them is their reputation. I don't think it's
also in tatters at this point. I mean,
that's true.
So Holly, what do you think as an institutional person?
Well, I think when I watch the film, what's coming back to me is the Amy McAdams played the female reporter, and she's the one who really went out and pounded the pavement and knocked on doors and started to put together the individual pieces of the puzzle. But it was so interesting the way people sort of already knew why she was there. And they either wanted to engage with her or they really did not. And so I think the story is out there. It's where are the venues for action to take place so that the justice that Marie and Mary that you're talking about can actually come to fruition. Because I think within the institutions we realize when things aren't going well, and there are certainly whispers and sort of underground tremors that something is not right. But it's often trying to figure out how do we raise this to a level of conversation that will result in action and in an actual process that will move towards that sense of restitution and really being heard and not just gossip.
And I think part of that from the institution's perspective is how do we assertively make it clear that we want to hear from people who've been harmed, so that we don't just, pass our policy and put it on the shelf, but we actually go out and tell people, there is a mechanism. We make it as easy as possible for them to access it, not as hard as possible, because that's part of what communicates whether or not we really want to hear from them.
Right, and that's why I like this movie so much, because it is a mainstream, accessible way. It's, oh my gosh, the Academy Award winner for the Best Picture of the Year. It is something that everyone can have access to, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do the discussion guide and actually provide parts of the discussion guide to say, talk about this as a congregation, or talk about this within your clergy peer group, or talk about this within your judicatory about how do you hold one another accountable to these ideals and ways of practice and good behavior.
So just say a little bit more about how that's gone, Holly, in terms of, so people know, and Sarah told us that the UCC version of the study guide is available in the resource list that we're going to see in a minute. But how has that gone? How has it been received? Are people using it? What is your sense?
My sense is that it has been used, and I think the interesting thing is that it's been picked up by individuals who are passionate about this particular issue or have a connection to this particular movie, but also by congregations as a whole. We made sure that there were about a dozen congregations as lead participants in using this study guide. So even before the guide was finalized, we approached the senior ministers at about a dozen congregations across the country and asked them, will you specifically offer this as part of your faith formation practices in your congregation? And so we do know that congregations ranging from Arizona to Virginia to Seattle to Florida have all spent time both going to collectively as a congregation to see the movie, and then also providing either a space in a more informal setting like a restaurant or a coffee shop to talk about it, or inviting members to see the movie and then come to the church to have conversations together using the discussion guide.
Well, it's very encouraging that the resources are out there and that people are taking advantage. Mary, do you have a sense of in Catholic communities that you might have any contact with, what the response has been in general to the movie and how it's being used?
Well, I do. Well, I don't actually have specifics. However, in conversation, I know that the movie has stimulated groups getting together and having discussions. I really like what Holly just shared and what you're doing, and I hope all religious communities will find out more about that and get involved in that process. And I know from friends, people that I've talked to in the church and not in the church, the conversations are going on, and it's doing its work in a lot of informal ways. And back to the Catholic Church, I have not heard of a specific action like you're talking about that they've done as a result of Spotlight.
Yeah.
But I have one concern. I don't know about your program in depth, but I would hope that it encourages anyone who has been abused by clergy to either go to an attorney or to the legal authorities. And because I don't think the church is the place that a survivor should first go. And on the other hand, some survivors may choose that, and it's always different for everyone. But to bear in mind that the sexual abuse and violation of anyone is a crime, and it needs to be reported. So I'd like to know that piece is also a part of the prevention steps. And
yeah, it is definitely part of the discussion guide that we put together. It's actually boxed out at the very end, specifically saying resources and support for victims of sexual abuse. And what was nice was to be able to create this resource in conjunction with Faith Trust Institute to make sure that we're talking both about the institutional side and how we as a denomination need to be able to talk clearly about our processes and procedures, but also how do we reach out to individuals who have experienced abuse.
And I think part of what you're speaking to, Mary, is, and again, we see it in the film, we see the need for institutions across the board to respond to this reality, because the whole thing about it takes a village, well, it takes all of our institutions to respond if we're going to be effective.
Right, and I don't think our institutions can police themselves, which is what they want to believe they can do. The military is an example, the church another example, and that is, I want to say, crazy thinking. That is not possible, and yet the Catholic Church still maintains that their committees and commissions can handle most of this. And it's not proven to be true for centuries.
Yeah. And I think part of what you're stating that so clearly, and I really appreciate that, and what those of us who have institutional responsibilities need to hear is, I assume that also reflects just simply the loss of trust in faith institutions to manage this problem, because we have not historically done a very good job. And so I hear your plea in that context of not only do we need to collaborate with others in the community around responding, but survivors need to know they have the option and the potential to go to an institutional setting outside of their faith tradition to ask for help initially.
Right, and not
it's
just
sad but true.
Yeah, and not just an option, but a responsibility to report it. It is a crime.
Right. And when it involves criminal behavior, absolutely, that's the bottom line.
Yes.
So Sarah, do we have any comments or concerns from folks?
We do indeed. So there's one person who suggested that denominations should hire independent sexual misconduct and abuse ombudspersons to act as advocates for victims, and I'm wondering how you would respond to that idea.
Ollie, you want to go with that first?
Right. I think it's one of the things that we use is the word interdependence, and that our institutions are never stand in isolation, and that there are really important partners in not only this conversation, but in all sorts of work that the church needs to do. And so we need to be able to not just replicate within inside our own walls the expertise that is available through partners, but to take advantage of these relationships. For example, being able to participate in things together like this webinar today, where we can rely on Faith Trust Institute or SNAP to have the expertise and to be able to network and resource appropriately. And I think, too, as we talk about denominational structures, there's also a really important distinction to make between the different types of polities or governance that happen in our different denominations. Some are much more hierarchical, some are hybrid, some are very congregationally oriented. And so it needs to be structured in a way that is appropriate to have the widest impact, depending on how each denomination is set up.
Yeah, and I think in terms of, again, I hear in that caller's question a concern that those of us in various institutional settings simply cannot be trusted to address these issues without an independent person. And I think we have to hear that and take that seriously, because I think we're all playing a matter of catch-up at this point in rebuilding the trust of our people in our institutions, all of them, to be able to address these issues. And I think it's going to take time, and we're going to have to really show that we are doing what needs to be done, and we are addressing it seriously, and we are willing to hold people accountable before our people really are going to assume that we have the capacity to at least do our part in this whole thing.
So speaking of accountability, we actually have several questions about accountability. One is about finding accountability within congregational structures, and the other is about, as bystanders, how do we respond to those that say that we need to forgive those who harm? So how do we hold them accountable?
Okay, do people have an hour that they'd like to stay on the call, and we'll address both of those issues.
Yes.
Well, let me just say quickly, because our time is limited, and then Holly and Mary, if you want to conclude with your comments. I think the issue of accountability is absolutely critical, and again, it's absolutely critical for rebuilding trust, but institutions do have a responsibility and a capacity to hold our own leadership accountable. I don't think we're adequately doing that necessarily, but we do have the responsibility to do that. And if we're gonna credential people on our behalf and basically say, you know, we vetted this person, we trust them to represent us with the public. I don't care whether it's a doctor or a therapist or a pastor. Then we have a responsibility to monitor, and if someone does step outside of the appropriate role that they're playing, then we have the capacity to be able to say, you can no longer represent us, you're done, end of story. And I think that's the piece that we can do. It doesn't necessarily stop a sex offender per se from going somewhere else until law enforcement becomes involved in a way that is able to up the ante with that person. But we do have that institutional responsibility to do that. The question about forgiveness, I'm just always fascinated, particularly in Christian context, how we always want to talk about this. And I think it's important because it is part of our tradition. It's part of who we see ourselves being. But I always feel like that when we're talking about this kind of harm done, not only to individuals, but to whole, groups of people by the mishandling of the sexual abuse cases, that forgiveness is something we talk about way down the path. Down the path to the point where there has been something done, there has been some accountability, there has been some experience of justice and healing for survivors. And then the question is, what does that forgiveness look like? And I mean, Jesus was the guy who said, for those who cause these little ones to stumble, they should have a millstone hung around their neck and they should be turned into the ocean. I mean, that was a pretty significant response to people who harm, particularly those who are most vulnerable. And so we're not talking about that intervention at this point, but I think we need to be very cautious about how we talk about forgiveness at the front end of people's disclosures and efforts to find justice within their institutional setting. So that's my 2 minutes. So let me ask Mary for you to comment on anything you want to conclude, and then Holly, and then we'll have to stop.
I would want to just add to forgiveness. It took a lifetime for me, over half a lifetime, to really get my arms around what forgiveness meant in my own life. And it was no small task. And eventually, just a couple of years ago, for me, it was a gift I gave myself. I realized it wasn't about the priest. It wasn't about the church. Forgiveness was about me, giving that gift to myself of being able to let go. But the point I want to make is it took years, and it took reflection and trying to just come to terms with what does it mean to forgive. And so it was a long process, and in my case it was giving myself the gift to be able to let go and give over to God, to the universe, and to let that go. And it had nothing to do with the priest, the church, or so forgiveness is not an easy thing, and it ought not be up front. I agree with you.
And the other thing I hear in that, Mary, that I think is really important is that in giving yourself that gift, you were basically saying, I'm done.
Exactly.
I don't need to carry the memory or the immediacy of that experience. I got things to do with my life.
Exactly.
And I'm done. So
that's right. And that took me until 3 years ago.
Right. Holly, any final comments?
Well, I just really appreciate this whole conversation, and I think in terms of the piece on accountability, I think it's very important for us to be clear what our ecclesial processes can and cannot do for those who are our clergy. For example, it means we could remove or suspend or terminate a minister's standing, but the ecclesial process cannot, for example, issue a restraining order. That is where the legal process needs to come in, and cannot diagnose mental health. That is where we need mental health providers and psychologists and psychiatrists. So I think each of us have an important role to play, and we need to do our part of that role to the very best of our ability, with the deepest integrity, with the most effective resources, and the best training, and openness and transparency about it.
Yep. And if we only do that, we will be making a huge step forward for our people. So let us make that commitment every day to the work that is before us. And I can't thank both of you enough for your time today and your contribution. This was a very rich experience and conversation. Sarah has a couple of things for us in terms of additional resources that our folks may want to hear about.
Thank you, Marie and Holly.
Thanks, Mary.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. I want to remind everyone that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month and Child Abuse Prevention Month. So we have resources for faith communities on our website. I have a whole list of resources that I will send you along with this PDF this afternoon. We have upcoming webinars. The next webinar is on May 11th. It's Faith and Culture Addressing the Needs of Jewish Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence. And also we have a free online book club that meets once every couple months and And the book that we're going to be discussing on May 18th is Lived Through This, Listening to the Stories of Sexual Violence Survivors, which is a fantastic book. So as I close out the webinar here, if you would just please take a moment and fill out the survey as you exit, we would be most appreciative of your feedback, your ideas, and suggestions. And I hope that you have a good day. Thank you all so much. Take care.